She sealed the letter she had sworn never to send, and then, because her hand would not be still, she pressed her thumb to the wet wax until it printed the whirl of her own skin into the crest of a duke she had never met. Eleanor Vane had not meant to use that seal. It had come to the parsonage in a box of oddments 3 winters past. A stray matrix stamped with a wren on a sprig of moorheather, the device of the House of Wrenmore, sold for a few pence at a Dorchester fair by a clerk who did not know its worth, or did not care. She had kept it because the bird was small and brave-looking, and because nobody else wanted it. Tonight, at the writing desk under the eaves, with one tallow candle guttering and the wind finding the gap beneath the window frame, she had reached for the nearest seal without thinking, and the wren had gone into the wax, and now the letter that bared the whole of her heart wore the mark of the most feared man in England. It did not matter. She would not send it. One did not send a letter to no one. She turned the folded sheet over in her ink-stained fingers. The candle threw her shadow long across the whitewashed wall, and the shadow's hand trembled, though she had told herself her own did not. Outside, an owl let go a single note over the churchyard, and the bell of St. Aldhelm's, which her father rang for prayers and for the departed, and for nothing in particular when the mood took in, hung silent in its tower 100 yards off across the wet grass. She had written letters for half the parish that winter. That was her work, though no one called it work, and no one paid her for it. The smith's wife who could not write sent word to a son gone for a soldier. Eleanor wrote it. Old Mr. Pardew, whose eyes had clouded, dictated his quarrel with his brother over a strip of glebe land. Eleanor wrote that too, and softened it where she could, so that the brothers might be brothers again before one of them was past mending. She knew the inside of every house in the village by the letters that left it. She knew who longed, and who grieved, and who was afraid, because they told her, sitting at her father's kitchen table with their hats in their hands. And she set it all down in her small, even hand, and asked for nothing. What no one knew was that she had begun, this past month, to write one letter of her own. She had told herself it was an exercise. A woman who spends her days pouring other people's hearts onto paper might be forgiven for wondering, once, what her own heart would look like in ink. So she had begun it. Dear Sir, though there was no sir, though there was no one. And she had meant to stop after a line. She had not stopped. Night after night she had taken it out and added to it, the way another woman might take out a length of unfinished lace. And tonight she had finished it, and now she did not know what to do with a finished thing, but could never go anywhere. I do not know your name, the letter said, near its end. I am not sure I should like to. A name is a door that opens both ways, and I have learned to my cost, but when a person comes to know me, they discover only how useful I am, and never trouble to look at the rest. I write this to no one, because no one cannot disappoint me. And yet, and here I am foolish, I confess I should like, once before I am old, to be read by someone the way I read others. To be known. Only that. Not married, not flattered, not needed for what my hands can do. Only known, and not found wanting. She read it back, and her face went hot in the cold room, and she reached for the candle to burn it. The latch of the kitchen door lifted below. Eleanor's hand stopped over the flame. She knew the footsteps that came up the parsonage stair, as she knew the village by its letters. And these were her father's, slow and fond, with the small drag of the left foot he would never admit to. She slid the sealed letter under the blotter, snuffed the candle between her dampened fingers without a hiss, and was lying still in the dark, with her heart going like the smith's hammer, by the time her father put his head round the door to see that she slept. "Good night, my Nell," he said softly to the dark. "Good night, Papa," she answered, and was glad he could not see her face. In the morning she would put the letter in the kitchen fire. She was almost certain she would. But in the morning the carrier's cart came early, and her father, who franked the parish post out of an old courtesy from the days when the living had been richer, swept the whole pile of village letters off the hall table into the carrier's bag with one absent arm, while he argued tithes with the church warden. And somewhere in that pile, under the blotter she had carried down to mend the spine of the parish register, sealed with a wren and addressed in her own hand to no one at all, went the letter that Eleanor Vane had sworn would never leave the room. She did not discover it gone until the cart was a mile down the Dorchester road, and by then it was only a smudge of canvas between the hedgerows, and there was no calling it back. The morning was very bright. The frost stood on the churchyard yews in white fur, and the rooks went up in a clatter when the cart's wheels struck the cattle grid. And Eleanor stood in the parsonage gate with her shawl clutched at her throat, and watched her own heart go away down the lane in a stranger's bag, sealed with the mark of a man she had never seen. She told herself the worst that could happen was that some clerk would open a letter addressed to no one, find it strange, and throw it on the fire she had been too cowardly to use herself. She was wrong about almost every part of that. Adrian Crane, 5th Duke of Renmore, received 41 letters that week, and read none of them, which was his custom. They came on a silver tray that his secretary, Mr. Halloran, set at his elbow each morning in the library at Renmore Court, and they sat there through breakfast and through the long grey middle of the day, and most evenings Halloran took them away again, unbroken, and answered them himself in the Duke's name, because the Duke had discovered, in the 2 years since the title had fallen on him like a roof beam, that not one of the 41 would ever say anything he wished to hear. He knew their kinds the way a man knows the calls of birds he is sick of. There were the petitions, a living wanted for a younger son, a mortgage to be eased, a road to be mended, a daughter to be presented. There were the invitations, which were petitions in better gloves. There were the letters of business, which Halloran could read better than he, and there were the letters from women, or from women's mothers, which had begun within a month of his brother's death and had not slackened since, and which addressed themselves with great tenderness to the Duke of Renmore, and his 30,000 a year, and his unentailed acres, and his clear blue eyes. And not one of them, not one in 2 years, had been written to Adrian. He stood now at the long library window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching his own breath fog the glass and clear again. And he turned the heavy signet ring on his right hand once with his thumb, which was the only outward sign he ever gave that he was thinking a thing he would not say. He was 28, and he had the shoulders of a man who had spent his boyhood breaking colts at the home farm before anyone supposed he would ever be anything but a second son. And he filled the tall window the way a portrait fills its frame, and the maids at Renmore crossed themselves a little when he passed, not because he was cruel. He had never in his life been cruel to a servant, but because he did not smile. And a duke who does not smile is more frightening than one who shouts. "The post, your grace," said Halloran, setting down the tray. "Burn it," said the Duke, not turning round. "There is one," said Halloran, with the particular dryness he kept for moments when he meant to be disobeyed, "that I cannot account for. It is sealed with your grace's own crest, and it is addressed to no one." The Duke turned. It lay on the top of the pile, a single folded sheet, the paper good but cheap, the wax a poor brown household wax, and pressed into the wax, small and badly struck and unmistakable, the wren of Renmore on its sprig of heather, with the faint print of a human thumb laid across the bird, as though someone had touched it before it cooled. There was no direction on the outside. Where the name should have stood, there was nothing at all, only a smear where the writer's hand had hovered and not written. "Account for it how you like," the Duke said. "I will read it myself." He did not know why. He told himself afterward, when he had read it 3 times, that he had only meant to find out which of his understewards had pilfered a matrix and sold it at a fair, for the seal was certainly stolen and certainly his. But that was the reason he gave the rational part of himself, and it was not the true one. The true one was simpler and he did not like it. The letter was addressed to no one, and Adrian Crane had spent 2 years receiving 41 letters a week that were addressed to his rank and never to him. And a letter to no one was the first letter in 2 years that did not want anything from him. He broke his own seal. He read it once, standing at the window, fast, the way a man reads a thing he expects to dismiss. He read it a second time sitting down, slowly, with the cold coffee set aside and forgotten. He read it a third time, aloud, very low, in the empty library, because there was a sentence in it he wanted to hear in the air, and not only behind his eyes. I should like, once before I am old, to be read by someone the way I read others. To be known. Only that. Not married, not flattered, not needed for what my hands can do. Only known, and not found wanting. When he had finished the third reading, the fire had burnt down, and the short winter day had gone grey to black in the window, and Halloran had come and gone twice and not been answered, and the Duke of Renmore sat with a stranger's letter in his 2 hands, and discovered that his throat ached. He turned it over. He held it to the lamp. The hand was a woman's, small and even and trained, the hand of someone who wrote a great deal and took pains. The paper was parish paper, the wax was kitchen wax. The seal was his own bird, stolen at a country fair within a day's ride. And there was the thumbprint in the wax, laid across the wren. Not to hide it, he thought, but the way one touches a thing one is fond of, without knowing one does it. "Halloran," he said, when at last the secretary came a third time. "Where did this come from? The frank, the postmark. Trace it." "Your Grace means to find the thief who took the seal." "I mean to find the woman who wrote the letter," said the Duke, and heard himself say it, and turned the signet ring once with his thumb, and said nothing more. It took him 4 days to find her, and they were the 4 longest days he had known since the week his brother had been buried, and at the end of them he did the maddest thing he had done in his life, which was to order his horse at 11 o'clock at night and ride 12 miles of frozen lane to a parsonage he had never seen, to knock at a door behind which a woman he had never met was, he very much hoped, asleep. He told himself, the whole cold ride, a dozen reasonable things. He told himself a man might return a stolen seal in person if he chose. He told himself he was a magistrate of the county and entitled to inquire how his crest had come to be sold at a fair. He told himself he would knock in the morning like a Christian and not at midnight like a thief. And then he did not turn back, because the truth, which he did not say even to the dark, was that he had read the letter so many times that he knew it by heart, and that he could not bear another night of lying awake, composing answers to a woman whose name he did not know, and that he had to lay eyes on her, or go quietly out of his senses. The parsonage stood low and pale beside its black church, and there was no light in any window, and the frost made the whole churchyard glitter under a clouded moon, and the wren of Renmore, had it been a living bird, would have been roosting somewhere in the yews with its head under its wing, and far more sense than the Duke. Adrian Crane swung down from his horse, looped the rein over the gatepost, walked up the flagged path past the sleeping graves, and lifted his gloved hand to the parsonage door. Then he stood there a long moment, the breath smoking from him in the cold, and did not knock. For it had come to him, too late, that he had no idea on earth what he meant to say. Eleanor woke because the rooks did not. She had slept badly every night since the cart took the letter, and her ear had grown wakeful, and somewhere below, in the frozen dark, a horse blew softly through its nose, and the gate latch she had oiled herself last autumn gave its small particular click, and the rooks in the yews, who would mob a fox or a poacher with a clamour fit to wake the whole churchyard, said nothing at all, which meant whoever crossed the churchyard came slowly and openly and without fear. She lay rigid under the cold counterpane. Her father slept at the far end of the house and slept like the stones in the floor. The candle was a stub on the chair beside her. She did not light it. She drew the shawl round her shoulders over her nightgown and went barefoot to the casement and looked down through the cold glass at the path. A man stood at the door below her, very tall, in a dark riding coat, white-shouldered with frost, and he had lifted his hand to knock and not knocked, and she could see by the set of him, the head a little bent, the gloved hands suspended, that he did not know what he was about any more than she did. A horse waited at the gate, breath rising. The man's other hand went, as she watched, to the breast of his coat, and pressed there once, flat, as though to be sure of something inside it, and Eleanor's heart turned right over in her, because she knew, the way one knows a thing in a dream before it has happened, exactly what was folded against that stranger's chest. She read it as the gesture of a man making certain of a thing he could not afford to lose. Whether she read it rightly, she could not have said. But she went down the stair in the dark, with her hand on the cold wall, and her bare feet finding the worn dip in each tread. And she drew back the bolt she had shot herself at curfew, and opened the parsonage door to the midnight, and the frost, and the man who had ridden 12 miles to stand in it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cold came in around him. He was younger than she had thought a duke would be. She did not yet know he was a duke, only that he was a gentleman, and grieving, and very strange to be where he was. And his eyes were a clear, cold blue that the moon made colder. And they went over her face once, quickly, the way her own eyes went over a letter, taking the whole of it. "You are not asleep," he said. His voice was low and rough at the edges, like a thing not much used. "I'd counted on your being asleep. I find I had not thought past that." "It is midnight, sir," Eleanor said, and was astonished her voice came at all. "Honest people are abed. What is your business at my father's door?" He took his hand from the breast of his coat and brought out the folded letter and held it up between them in the frostlight so that she could see the broken wax and the small, badly struck wren, and she felt the colour leave her face all at once, and was glad of the dark. "My business," said the man very quietly, "is that I have read this 3 times, and I could not for the life of me discover how to answer it by post, so I have come to answer it at the door. You wrote that you wished, once before you were old, to be known. I have ridden a long way in the cold to tell you that I have read you, madam, every word, and that I did not find you wanting." Eleanor Vane stood in her own doorway with her shawl clutched to her throat, and the man's words going through her like the cold. And she did not faint, and she did not weep, and she did not, to her lasting astonishment, slam the door in his face. She gripped the edge of it until the old oak bit her palm. "You had no right," she said, when she could speak. "That letter was sent to no one. It was sent to no one on purpose." "I know it," he said. "That is why I read it. It is the first letter in 2 years that did not want a thing from me." He paused, and the frost smoked between them. And somewhere a long way off the church clock began, with a groan of old gears, to tell the hour. "My name is Crane. I am the man whose seal you stole at a fair in Dorchester, and I have come to give it back, and to ask you who you are. And I find that of the 3 errands, the seal is the one I care least about." The clock struck 12, slow and iron, over the sleeping graves. "You may as well come in," said Eleanor, "before you wake my father and the whole sleeping churchyard." She lit the kitchen candle with hands that shook, and set him in the chair where the village brought its sorrows, on the far side of the scrubbed deal table, and stood herself by the banked fire with the poker in her hand, less for the fire than for the having of something to hold. In the candlelight, she saw him better and liked him less, or told herself she did. He was too large for the low kitchen. He filled it the way she imagined his kind filled everything, by being born to fill it. His coat was very fine under the frost. His gloves, when he drew them off and laid them on the table, were kid so soft they kept the shape of his hands, and his hands, bare, were not a gentleman's idle hands at all. They were broad and hard across the palm, with a white seam of old scar at the base of one thumb, the hands of a man who had done work once. And she did not know what to make of that, and so she did not look at them again. "You have not given me my answer," he said. "I have not given you my name," said Eleanor. "I am Miss Vane. My father holds the living here, such as it is. I write letters for the parish because I can, and I write them well. And that is the whole of what there is to know of me. And you have ridden 12 miles in the cold for it, sir, which I think very ill spent." "You have just told me 3 things you said in the letter were not in it," the Duke said. "You said you write well, you said it is the whole of you, and you said it ill, as though daring me to agree." He turned the signet ring on his hand once, slowly, and looked at her across the candle. "In the letter you were braver." The poker rang against the hearthstone where her hand had let it knock. "In the letter," she said, low, "I was speaking to no one. It is very easy to be brave to no one, sir. You have ruined that for me. You have made me an audience where I had none, and now I shall never be able to write a true word again without wondering who reads it." She heard her own voice climb and brought it down by main force. "Have you any notion what you have done? Not to my dignity, that is a small thing, but to the one place I had that was entirely mine?" He was quiet a moment. The candle leaned in a draught and righted itself. "Yes," he said at last. "I have a notion. I receive 41 letters a week, Miss Vane, and not one of them is to me. They are to the Duke." He said the word with a flatness that was its own kind of feeling. I had begun to think there was no longer a man inside the title for a letter to reach. And then a letter came that was to no one. And I found I was no one too, and I read it. And for the length of 3 readings, I was a man again, and not a rank. So I do know what I have taken from you, because the same thing was taken from me 2 years ago, when my brother was lost, and I became this." He looked down at the ring and turned it and stilled his hand. "I am sorry for it. I will not say I am sorry I read it." Eleanor stared at him. "The Duke," she said. "You said, the Duke, you are the—" She looked at the wren in the broken wax on the table between them, and looked at the man, and the whole cold floor of the kitchen seemed to tilt. "You are the Duke of Renmore. I sealed my letter. My heart, sir. I sealed the whole of my heart with your bird and sent it to no one. And it came to you." "It came to me," he agreed. "Of all the men in England," said Eleanor faintly, "I confessed myself to the one they say has a heart like the moor in February." The Duke of Renmore looked at her across the candle, and something moved at the corner of his hard mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the country a smile comes from. "They are not wrong about February," he said, "but you should hear them on the subject of March." It surprised her into a sound that was almost a laugh, caught and bitten off, and she pressed her lips together and turned to the fire so that he should not see it. And the Duke, who had not made another human being smile in longer than he cared to count, watched the back of her bent neck in the candlelight, and felt the ache come into his throat again, and was very glad she had turned away. He went before her father woke. He left the seal on the table, and his card, which she did not look at, and a single line, not a promise, for he was learned enough in being petitioned to know what promises were worth, but a fact. "I shall come back by daylight," he said, drawing on his soft gloves at the door, "and knock like a Christian, and ask your father's leave to know his daughter. You may refuse me, but you will not, I think, be able to pretend I do not exist, and that is the only revenge I can offer you for what I have read." And then he was gone into the grey before dawn, and Eleanor stood in the cold doorway listening to the horse go down the lane, and put her hand to the place on her chest where his hand had pressed his coat, and found her own heart going there like a thing knocking to be let out. She did not sleep again that night, and she did not burn anything, for there was nothing left to burn. He came back by daylight, as he had said, and he knocked like a Christian, and the parsonage was thrown into a confusion that lasted a week. The Reverend Mr. Vane was a gentle, abstracted man, who had buried a wife and raised a daughter, and ceased, somewhere in those years, to expect anything of the world but the slow turning of the church seasons. And he received the news that the Duke of Renmore wished to call upon his Eleanor, with the air of a man told that the river had begun to run uphill. Not with disbelief, exactly, but with a sense that the natural order had suffered a strain it might not recover from. He was too kind to ask his daughter what she had done to bring a duke to the door, and she was too proud to tell him, and so the great fact sat between them at the breakfast table unspoken, like a guest who would not eat. The village was not so delicate. By the second day it was known at the forge, and the well, and the back of the church, that his Grace of Renmore had called twice at the parsonage, and by the third day it was known why, or rather it was known in 11 contradictory whys, each of them wrong, and each more interesting than the truth. Mrs. Pardew had it that the Duke was a connection of the late Mrs. Vane's, and had come about a legacy. The churchwarden's wife had it that Eleanor was to be made governess to some Renmore cousin, and good riddance to her heirs. And the smith's wife, who loved Eleanor for the letters she had written to a soldier son, said roundly that anybody with eyes in their head could see his Grace had come courting, and that the parish would do well to mind its own affairs, which silenced no one and inflamed everyone. Eleanor heard all of it, because the parish brought its gossip to the same kitchen table where it brought its grief, and she set it down in no letter, and answered it in no word, and went about her work with her chin up and her face composed, and her heart in a state she could not have set down in ink if she had tried. For the Duke kept coming. He came on the Tuesday, and walked with her father in the glebe field, talking of drainage and the price of wool, and her father came in flushed and bright-eyed as Eleanor had not seen him in years, and said the Duke understood land, by George, understood it from the ground up, which was more than most of his sort. He came on the Thursday, and sat in the parlour drinking tea he plainly did not want, and answered Eleanor's cool questions with a dryness that more than matched her own, and stayed exactly the half-hour that propriety allowed, and not 1 minute more, and bowed at the door with a correctness so complete it was its own form of teasing. He came on the Saturday, and brought, not flowers, which she would have scorned, and not jewels, which she would have flung at his head, but a battered second-hand copy of a book of letters, the correspondence of a long-departed poet, with a slip of paper marking a page where the poet had written to a friend that to be truly read by one person was worth more than the applause of nations. "You need not credit it," the Duke said, when she found the marked page. "Poets exaggerate, but I thought you might like to know you are not the only person in the history of the world to have wished it." Eleanor held the book, and did not look up from it for rather too long. "You found this," she said, "in 4 days." "I have a great deal of leisure," said the Duke, "and very little I wish to do with it. Until lately." She put the book down, because to hold it longer was to admit something she was not ready to admit. "You should not come so often," she said. "The village talks." "The village," said the Duke, "has talked of me for 2 years, and never once to my face, and never once said a thing that was true. I find I do not greatly fear the village. Do you?" "I have lived my whole life in it," said Eleanor. "It is a different thing to fear from inside." He was quiet at that, and turned the ring on his hand, and she thought she saw, and it surprised her, that she had told him something he had not known, and that he had heard it. A man who could be told a thing was rarer in her experience than a duke. She had known several men who could be told nothing at all, and married, very nearly, the worst of them. His name had been Mr. Tobias Frayne, and he had come to the parish as a young man reading for the law with a relation of the squire's 3 summers ago, and he had been the handsomest creature Eleanor had ever seen, with a way of bending his bright head to listen that made a woman feel she was the only thing in the room worth hearing. He had discovered, within a fortnight, that the parson's daughter wrote a fair hand and a fairer letter, and he had brought her his briefs to copy and his verses to correct, and at last, his love letters to a Bath heiress to compose. And Eleanor, who was 19 and had never been looked at, had written those letters to another woman with her own heart breaking, and had told herself the whole time that he could not see it, that he saw her, that a man who needed her so could not help but come to love her. He had married the heiress in the spring on the strength of the letters Eleanor wrote, and had not troubled to tell Eleanor himself. She had read it in the paper. And among the things he left behind in his lodgings when he went, the landlady had returned to the parsonage a packet of Eleanor's own letters. Not the ones she had written for him, but a few foolish, hoping ones she had ventured to write to him, in her own person, in her own heart. And every one of them was unbroken. He had never read a single word. He had taken what her hands could do, and never once looked at the rest. She had burned those letters herself, in this same kitchen fire at 19, and had made herself a vow over the ash of them that she had kept for 7 years. That she would never again set down a true word where a man might take it and leave the rest. She would write for the parish all her life. She would never again write for herself. She had broken that vow exactly once, this past month, in the dark, to no one. And the letter had gone to a duke. She told him none of this, but he found out a piece of it, as men of property find things out, by the casual offices of those who serve them, for the squire was a tenant of sorts to Renmore in a tangle of old leases, and the squire's relation remembered the handsome young law student and his fortunate marriage, and remembered, when pressed, that there had been some talk of the parson's clever daughter who had written the man's letters for him, and the duke, hearing it over a dull dinner where he had not expected to hear anything at all, set down his glass very carefully and changed the subject, and rode home thinking. He came to the parsonage the next day, not in the afternoon, but in the cold, bright morning, and he did not stay in the parlour. He asked instead, with a formality that put her on her guard at once, whether Miss Vane would do him the honour of walking with him as far as the lower meadow, where he wished her opinion on a matter of the parish. And her father, delighted, all but pushed her into her cloak, and so she found herself walking out of the village, beside the Duke of Renmore in the frost, with the rooks going up before them, and the whole street watching from behind its curtains. The frost lay thick in the ruts of the lane, and crunched under their feet, and the breath stood white before their mouths, and for a while neither of them said anything. And the silence was not the cool fencing silence of the parlour, but something newer and more dangerous. He had shortened his long stride to hers without seeming to. She had noticed that he always did, and had decided not to be moved by it, and was moved by it. "I have learned a thing about you," the Duke said at last, "that I had no right to learn, which is becoming a habit with me where you are concerned, and which I dislike in myself. I will tell you what it is, and then I will tell you why, and then you may be as angry as you please." Eleanor's hand went, without her willing it, to the old ink stain on the middle finger of her right glove, and pressed it through the kid. "There was a man," the Duke said, looking ahead at the frosted hedge and not at her, which, she understood, later, was a courtesy. "A young man, a few years past, who came to this place and learned that you could write a better letter than he could, and used you to win a wife with words that were yours, and went away married, and never read a line you wrote to him in your own person." He paused. The frost cracked under his boot. "I do not know the whole of it. I know enough. And I have spent 3 days being so angry at a man I have never met that I have frightened my own household. And I came to tell you so, because it seems to me a cowardly thing to know it, and pretend I did not." Eleanor walked a dozen paces in silence, with her face turned away toward the white meadow. And when she trusted her voice, she said, "And this is why you supposed I should like to be known?" Because you discovered I had once been used and not known, and you thought to be the man who does the other thing. To collect me, sir, where another man discarded me. It is the same transaction. It only wears a kinder coat. He stopped in the lane. She stopped too, a pace on, and turned and made herself look at him, because she had said the cruelest true thing she could find, and she would not be coward enough to say it to his shoulder. The Duke's face, in the hard morning light, had gone very still. He did not turn the ring. He held her eyes, and there was no offence in his, only a kind of grave attention, as though she had said something difficult and right, and he was doing it the honour of thinking before he answered. "That would be the same transaction," he said slowly, "if I had come because you were useful, and I did not. You are not useful to me, Miss Vane. I have a secretary who writes a hand as fair as yours and a great deal faster, and 41 correspondents I would happily give him entire. I have no want in the world that your pen can supply." He took a breath, and the white of it hung between them. "I came because for the length of 3 readings, I stopped being a thing and was a man, and I've not been able to find my way back to being a thing since, and I do not wish to. That is not a transaction. I do not know what it is. I had hoped you might help me find out, but I see that I have gone about it like a duke, which is to say like a battering ram, and I am sorry." The rooks settled in the bare elm above them. Somewhere a dog barked, twice, and was quiet. Eleanor stood in the frozen lane and looked at the most feared man in England telling her, badly and plainly, and without the smallest grace, that she was the one person who had no use to him at all, and found that of every word that had ever been said to her, it was the one she had most wanted to hear, and never known to wish for. "You are very strange," she said, "for a duke." "So I am told," said the Duke, "chiefly by my aunt." His aunt was Lady Sabine Marlowe, and she arrived at Wrenmore Court within the week, summoned by no one and welcomed by less, in a travelling carriage the colour of a bruise, with 3 maids and a great quantity of luggage, and a smile that did not reach the cold and perfect length of her face. She was not, in strict fact, the Duke's aunt. She was the widow of a cousin once removed, which is a connection that, in the careful arithmetic of great families, counts for everything when it is convenient, and nothing when it is not. She was 27, and very beautiful, in the hard, polished way of a woman who has made her face her fortune and tends it like an estate, with black hair and a white throat, and eyes the colour of weak tea. And she had decided, on the day the old Duke was laid to rest and the new one came so unexpectedly into 30,000 a year, that she would be the next Duchess of Wrenmore. And she had been very patient, and her patience had just been informed by a maid's letter that it was in danger of being wasted on a parson's daughter who wrote letters for the poor. She came down to dinner the first night in amber silk and put her cool hand on the Duke's sleeve and called him, "My dear Adrian," in a voice pitched for the footman to hear, and asked after his health and his hounds and his happiness, and then, over the soup, after the curious rumour she had heard, surely it could not be true, that he had been seen riding out to some village living to pay court to a clergyman's daughter, and watched his face while she said it, the way a card player watches a turned card. "I have been to Aldermstoke twice," said the Duke, "and walked once with Miss Vane in the lower meadow, and intend to do so again as often as she will permit. I am glad the county is so well informed. It saves me the trouble of announcements." Lady Sabine laughed, a small silver laugh with a file in it. "You were always droll, Adrian. But you will forgive an old woman." She was not old. She said it as a weapon. "For caring what becomes of you. A parson's daughter. A girl who writes letters for hire. The world is unkind, my dear, and it will say things, and it will say them whether they are true or not. And a name once spoken is not easily unspoken. I should be failing in my duty to your poor brother's memory if I did not say so." The Duke set down his spoon. "You will leave my brother out of it," he said very quietly, and the temperature of the table dropped 10 degrees, and the footman by the sideboard found something absorbing to do with the salver. And Lady Sabine, who had played many hands in her life and knew the value of a small, graceful retreat, inclined her beautiful head and spoke of the weather and bided her time. But she had learned what she came to learn, which was that it was true, and worse than true, and that the Duke meant it. And a woman who has spent 2 years and a great deal of patience on a duchy does not surrender it to a parson's daughter without first making certain there is nothing in the parson's daughter's history that a careful hand might use. She had heard of the letters. Everyone had heard of the letters. The village could speak of nothing else. And it occurred to Lady Sabine, lying awake in the best blue guest room with the moon on the ceiling, that a woman who confesses her whole heart on paper is a woman who has written down, somewhere, in her own hand, exactly the thing she would most wish unwritten. And that such a thing, in the right hands, at the right moment, before the right people, would do more than any number of arguments at dinner. She did not yet know what the letter said. She set herself, with the patience that was her one true gift, to find out. The Duke and Eleanor, knowing nothing of this, were happy that fortnight, in the careful, unspoken way of two people who have each been hurt, and are each waiting to be hurt again, and are each, against their own better counsel, beginning not to be afraid. He taught her to ride a slow, safe cob from his stables on the frozen bridle paths above the village, because she had confessed she had never been on a horse, and had always wished to see the moor from its top. And he led the cob himself, with the rein looped over his hard, scarred hand, and did not once let go. And Eleanor sat very upright, and terrified, and exhilarated, and looked out over the white, rolling moor at the top of the rise, and forgot, for whole minutes together, to be careful. She taught him, without meaning to, a great many things he had not known about his own people, for she knew the inside of every house from the letters, and she told him, as they rode, whose roof leaked, and whose son had not written, and whose old quarrel might be mended by a word from the great house. And the Duke listened, and remembered, and quietly set Halloran to mend the roofs, and Eleanor, riding past a fortnight later, and seeing the new thatch gold against the grey, understood what he had done, and said nothing, and the not saying was sweeter than thanks. They argued too, which she had not expected, and came to prize above the rest. He thought she made too little of herself. She thought he made too much of his rank's cruelty, and not enough of its uses. She told him roundly that a duke who would not read his own letters was a coward dressed as a recluse, and that the petitions he so despised were 41 human beings in need, and that he might do worse with his 30,000 a year than read what the poor had taken pains to write him. He was silent a long time after that, and then he began, that very week, to read them, and to answer a few, in his own hand, badly, the labour showing in every line. And Eleanor, when he showed her the first one, a clumsy, kind letter to a war widow whose pension had snagged in the offices, felt something give way in her chest that she had walled up at 19. "It is a very bad letter," she said, blinking hard at it. "The grammar is shocking, and you have called her Madam 4 times. "I have a secretary who would do it better," said the Duke. "I did not wish him to do it better. I wished to do it myself, and badly. You have made me ridiculous, Miss Vane. I read letters now. I shall be writing verses next." "God forbid," said Eleanor, and laughed, properly this time, the first whole laugh he had won from her, and the sound of it went through the cold library at Renmore like the first warm wind of the year. And the Duke looked at her, laughing over his bad letter, with the lamp gilding her ink-stained hand, and knew, with the plain certainty of a man who has stopped lying to himself, exactly what had happened to him, and did not yet say so, because it was not the time, and because he had read in her letter what it had cost her to be unread, and he would not spend the word until he was certain she would believe it. The morning before the Renmore tenants' dinner, a great annual affair to which the Duke, breaking 10 years of his predecessor's custom, had bidden the whole parish, gentle and simple alike, and to which Eleanor and her father were of course invited. Eleanor came down very early to the parsonage kitchen and found that the household's small store of letters, kept in the dresser drawer where her father put the parish post to be franked, had been disturbed. It was a small thing, a drawer not quite shut, the letters not quite as she had left them. Her clergyman's house is not a fortress, and the maid-of-all-work had a follower, and the carrier came and went, and there were a dozen innocent explanations, and Eleanor told herself all of them, while a cold finger walked slowly up her spine. She counted the letters. None was gone. She looked for the one letter that mattered, the Duke's own seal, which he had left on the kitchen table that first midnight, and which she went cold all over, which she had not burned, because she could not bring herself to burn anything of his, but had folded into the back of her own commonplace book, and kept, like the foolish 19-year-old she had sworn never to be again. The commonplace book was in the drawer. It had been moved, and tucked into its back, where she had hidden the wren seal, and, with it, she had forgotten. She had been mad. She had kept it out of some sickness of sentiment she could not name. The fair copy she had made, before she sent the original, of the very letter. The whole confession, in her own clear hand. A second copy. She turned the pages with hands gone clumsy. The fair copy was gone. She did not know who had taken it, and she could not prove it had been taken, and she could not, for shame, tell her father what the missing papers said. And so she went to the tenants' dinner that night with a smile pinned to her white face and a horror sitting under her ribs. And she watched the doors, and she did not know what she watched for. Renmore Court was a blaze of light. The Duke had thrown open the great hall that had stood dark for 10 years, and there were 200 candles, and a fire you could have roasted an ox at, and trestle tables down the length of it, groaning with the Duke's beef and the Duke's ale. And at the head, a smaller table where the gentry sat, and the whole strange democracy of it, the smith beside the squire, the war widow Eleanor had named to him eating off Renmore silver, was so plainly the Duke's own doing, so plainly the act of a man trying clumsily to be the thing Eleanor had told him he might be, that she could have wept at it if she had not been so afraid. The Duke found her almost at once, and brought her a glass of negus she did not drink, and stood beside her at the edge of the firelight, with the noise of the feast around them, and bent his dark head to hers to be heard. "You are pale," he said. "What has happened?" "Nothing," said Eleanor, who had never in her life been able to lie to anyone who troubled to look at her, and saw him see it. "That," said the Duke, "is the worst written letter you have ever sent me. Tell me." And she might have. She had drawn breath too, when across the hall, at the gentry table, Lady Sabine Marlowe rose to her feet in amber silk, with a glass in her hand and a paper in the other, and her silver voice cut through the noise of 200 people like a wire through cheese, and the feast began, raggedly, to fall quiet to hear what the great lady would say. "Friends," said Lady Sabine, and smiled her cold and beautiful smile down the length of the hall, and the word in her mouth was an obscenity. "His Grace has done us all so great an honour tonight, gathering us together, gentle and simple, in his own hall, that I cannot let the evening pass without a word. We have all heard the happy rumour. We have all seen his Grace's particular kindness to a certain young person of this parish." Her tea-coloured eyes found Eleanor in the firelight, and held her there, pinned, like a moth to a board. "And I thought, what could better suit such an occasion than to hear, from her own pen, in her own incomparable words, the sentiments of the lady who has so captured our noble host. For she is famous, is she not, for her letters?" The hall had gone silent. Eleanor could not move. Beside her, she felt the Duke go very still and very large, like a wall before a storm. Lady Sabine unfolded the paper. "I do not know your name," she read, in a clear, carrying voice, with a little smile at each phrase, savouring it. I am not sure I should like to. A name is a door that opens both ways, and I have learned to my cost, but when a person comes to know me, they discover only how useful I am. She got no further. Eleanor never afterward remembered crossing the hall. She remembered only that she was standing at the parsonage edge of the firelight one moment, perishing by inches, and the next moment she was at the gentry table, with her ink-stained hand flat upon the red paper, pressing it down to the cloth, and her own voice, which she had thought lost forever, ringing out steady and cold over 200 staring faces. "You read very well, madam," Eleanor said. "It is a pity you read another woman's letter without her leave. Shall I tell the company how it came into your hand? Or will you?" The silence in the hall was absolute. Lady Sabine's smile did not falter, but a muscle moved in her white throat. "You forget yourself," she said softly. "You forget where you are and to whom you speak." "I forget nothing," said Eleanor. "I am the parson's daughter who writes letters for the poor, and I am not ashamed of one word I have ever written, in my own person or in others. And I will not be made ashamed of this one in this hall by a lady who came into my father's house. For it was my father's house, was it not, where this was taken, since I keep it locked in my own book, and no one in this parish would touch it, and went through a clergyman's drawers like a thief in the night to find a thing to wound a girl she has never spoken to. You wished the company to hear the letter, madam. By all means, let them hear it. Give it to me. I will read it myself, every word, and let them judge between the heart that wrote it and the hand that stole it." She held out her ink-stained hand for the paper. For one long, terrible moment, Lady Sabine Marlowe looked at the parson's daughter, standing white and steady, with her hand outstretched, and at the 200 faces turned now not to the great lady, but to the girl, and at the Duke rising slowly to his feet at the head of the table, with a look on his face that she had never seen there and never wished to see again. And she understood, with the swift, cold arithmetic that was her one gift, that she had played her hand and lost it, and that the only thing worse than retreating now would be to go on. She let the paper fall from her fingers to the table. "You are welcome to it," she said, with a small, contemptuous shrug that fooled no one, least of all herself. "It is a very vulgar letter. I find I have no appetite for the rest." And she gathered her amber silk and went out of the hall by the small door behind the dais, with her chin up and the candlelight catching the rings on her cold hands. And 200 people watched her go, and not one of them rose to follow, and the great fire crackled in the sudden silence she left behind. It was Eleanor who broke it. She picked up her own letter from the table, where Lady Sabine had let it fall, and she folded it once, along the old crease, with hands that had stopped shaking, and she turned to the 200 faces, the smith and the war widow, and the church warden's wife, and her own father, white and trembling halfway out of his seat. And she said, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of the hall, clear and not unkind, "It is no great matter after all. It is only a letter from a woman who wished, once, to be known. I dare say there is no one in this hall who has not wished the same." She looked, as she said it, not at the gentry table, but down the long trestles at the people she had written for all her life, the people who had brought their hearts to her kitchen table. "I have written your letters these 7 years. I know your hearts better than any of you would care to own at this moment, so I'm not afraid to have you know mine. Eat your dinner." His Grace went to a deal of trouble for it. And after a moment, it was the smith's wife who began it, with a bark of a laugh and a thump of her tankard on the board. The hall began, raggedly, and then warmly, and then with a roar, to do exactly that. And the danger passed over like a cloud off the sun, and Eleanor stood in the firelight at the head of the Duke's table, and found that she was, after all, still standing. The Duke came to her side. He did not touch her, for 200 people watched. but he stood very close and bent his head and said, low, for her alone, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I have read a great many letters this month, Miss Vane, learning to do it. I had thought I was learning from a master. I see now I had not seen you read aloud." He paused. "Remind me never to be on the wrong side of you." "You were on the wrong side of me at midnight in my own doorway," said Eleanor, not looking at him, her own voice unsteady now that the worst was over. "And survived it? I think you will do." They did not speak of love that night, for the moment was too public and too raw, and the Duke had learned, from the very letter that started it all, that the word she most needed was not the loud one. But he saw her and her father safe into the carriage he insisted upon, and he stood bareheaded in the cold of his own courtyard while it pulled away, and Eleanor looked back through the small window and saw him standing there in the torchlight, very large and very alone among his servants, watching the carriage go, with one hand pressed flat to the breast of his coat, where there was now nothing folded at all. For the letter was hers again, in her own reticule, against her own heart. And she understood that he had given her back her own words, and kept nothing of her but the memory, and that this, of all the things a man had ever done to her, was the one she did not know how to bear. She slept that night for the first time in a fortnight. She woke to find the world had changed in the way the worst worlds change, not with thunder, but with a quiet, reasonable knock at the parsonage door, and a letter on good paper, sealed with the wren, that was not, this time, for no one. It was addressed to the Reverend Mr. Vane, in the Duke's own bad, clumsy, improving hand, and it was a very correct letter, and it asked, in form, the question that the whole parish had been asking in gossip for a fortnight, whether His Grace of Wrenmore might have the honour of paying his addresses, with a view to marriage, to Miss Eleanor Vane. Her father read it twice, and took off his spectacles, and polished them, and put them on, and read it a third time, and looked at his daughter across the breakfast table with his gentle, abstracted face working, and said, "Now, my Nell, are you happy?" And Eleanor, who had armoured herself against everything but that, put down her bread and went round the table and knelt by her father's chair, and put her face against his old coat that smelled of candle wax and the church, and could not, for a moment, answer at all. It should have been the end. It was very nearly the end, but there was the matter of the old fear she had carried since she was 19, the vow she had sworn over the ash of her own burned letters, which a kind man's correct proposal could not by itself dissolve, and it rose up in her now, in the very hour of her happiness, blacker than it had ever been. For happiness, she found, was more frightening than misery, having so much further to fall. She walked out alone that afternoon, telling her father she wished to think, and she did not go toward Wrenmore, but away from it, up the frozen bridle path to the top of the moor where the Duke had first led her cob. And she stood at the top in the bitter wind with the whole white country falling away below her, and she made herself look, at last, squarely at the thing she had been refusing to look at since midnight a fortnight ago. He had read her letter. He had been moved by it. He had ridden through the cold and stood in her doorway and said the words she had wished her whole life to hear. And then, she had been useful to him after all, had she not? She had taught him to read his letters, to mend his roofs, to open his hall, to be the Duke his people needed. She had made him, in a fortnight, more beloved in his own country than 2 years of his silence had managed. He had said she had no use to him, but she had been useful, enormously, exactly as Tobias Frayne had found her useful. A man who marries the woman who has improved him is not so different, she told the wind, with the old, cold voice of 19, from a man who marries the woman who writes his letters. He had been alone and unread and frozen, and she had warmed and read and thawed him, and now he was grateful. And gratitude in a proud man wears the coat of love so well that even the man himself cannot tell them apart. He did not love her. He loved being known. She had given him the experience of being known, the way she had once given Tobias the experience of being loved, in letters that were really hers. And when the novelty of it cooled, when he had a duchess and an heir and a county that adored him, he would look up one day from his 30,000 a year and see across the table not the woman whose heart had moved him at midnight, but only the clever parson's daughter who had been so very useful. And he would be too kind to say it, and she would see it in his face, which would be worse than his ever saying it. And she would die a little every day of the rest of her life of being, again, used and not known. She had taken him for what his attention could do for her starved, unread heart. He had taken her for what her warmth could do for his frozen one. It was the same transaction. It only wore a kinder coat. She stood on the top of the moor in the wind until her face was numb, and then she went down, and she wrote the Duke a letter, the last she meant ever to write for herself. And it was the bravest and the most cowardly thing she had ever done, for she told him the whole of her reasoning, plainly, and without a single tear blotting the page, and she told him she could not marry him, and she told him why, that she would not be useful to a man again, not even a man as kind as he, and that gratitude was not love, however little he could presently tell them apart, and that she would rather be unread and her own for the rest of her life than be his, and find out too late that she had only been useful after all. She sealed it with her own poor brown wax, and no crest at all, for the wren was his, and she had no more right to it, and she sent it by the carrier in the morning, and this time she did not call it back, because this time she meant it. And a thing meant cannot be unmeant by chasing a cart. The letter reached Renmore at noon, and the Duke read it once, fast, the way a man reads a thing he does not believe, and a second time, slowly, sitting down, with the colour going out of his face. And he did not read it a third time, because he could not. He sat in the library where it had begun, with her letter in his two hard hands, and the fire burned down, and Halloran came and went and was not answered, and the short day went grey to black in the window, exactly as it had a month before. Only now the man at the window was not waking up out of 2 years of being a thing into being a man, but going back down, alone, into the dark she had pulled him out of, and finding it colder than before, because now he knew what the warmth had been. She thought she had been useful to him. She thought he was grateful, and called it love, because he could not tell them apart. He read that in her own clear hand, the hand that had taught him to read. And the worst of it, the thing that took the breath out of him and left him sitting in the dark, was that he could not, by any letter, by any argument, by any number of words, however well or badly written, prove to her that she was wrong. For the whole of her belief was that words could be used, that a heart on paper could be taken, and the rest left. And she had built a wall of it 7 years high, and he was a man who had only just learned to read, and he did not have the words to take it down, and he knew it. She had unread him with his own lesson. She had used the very thing he loved her for to put herself forever out of his reach. He thought, for a black hour, of letting her go. It was what she asked. It was, very possibly, the kindest thing. And he was learning to be kind. A better man, he told himself, would honour the lady's clear-stated wish and trouble her no more. Then he thought, I have spent 2 years being the man who does not trouble anyone, who reads no letters and answers none, and lets the world wash past unanswered, and it nearly killed the man in me. And she is the one who taught me that to be silent out of pride is only cowardice in a better coat. She has just done the same thing she cured me of. She has gone silent, out of fear dressed as principle, and called it setting me free. And he got up out of the dark library, and rang for his horse, and he did not wait for daylight, and he did not knock like a Christian. It was past 11 when Eleanor heard the gate latch click and the rooks say nothing, and she knew, before she went to the casement, exactly who stood below in the frost with his hand at the breast of his coat. And she stood a long time in the cold dark of her room, with her heart breaking, and very nearly did not go down, because she had meant her letter, and to go down was to risk everything she had decided on the top of the moor. But she had opened the door to him once before in the dark, and she found that she was not, after all, the woman who could leave a man standing in the frost a second time. Not this man. And so she went down the stair, with her hand on the cold wall and her bare feet in the worn dips of the treads, and she drew the bolt, and she opened the parsonage door to the midnight a second time. And there he stood. He looked terrible. He looked as she felt. The frost was white on his shoulders, and his face was grey, and his clear blue eyes were red at the rims, and he did not have a letter in his hand this time, and he did not have a seal, and he did not have a single one of the careful, correct words a duke ought to have. He had ridden 12 miles in the cold with nothing at all. "I have no letter," he said. His voice was wrecked. "I read yours. I have read a great many letters this month, you taught me, and I have learned to answer them. And I find I cannot answer this one. There are no words in it. You have written me a wall, and I have stood at the bottom of it all afternoon looking for the door, and there is no door. So I have come without words, because words are the thing you do not trust, and I do not blame you, and I will not insult you with them." Eleanor stood gripping the door. "Then why have you come?" she whispered. "To be useless to you," said the Duke of Renmore. "You said you would not be useful to a man again. Very well. Be useless to me. I do not want your pen. I have a secretary. I do not want your warmth for my house, or your knowledge of my people, or your skill at making me a better duke. Halloran can hire all of that, and I would dismiss all of it tomorrow and count it cheap if you would only—" His voice broke, and he stopped, and turned the signet ring on his hand once, the old habit, the only outward sign. Then he did a thing she had never seen him do. He pulled the ring off his finger, the great, heavy duke's ring with the wren on it, and he held it out to her in the cold. Not as a betrothal, but as something else, something she did not understand until he spoke. "I came to give you this, not to make you a duchess, to take the duke off my own hand for 1 minute and stand in your doorway as the man you wrote to, the no one, and ask the no one's question. Not, will you marry the Duke of Renmore? That is the question with the use in it. The other one. The one from your letter." He swallowed. "Will you let yourself be known by a man who has nothing you need, and wants nothing you can do, and only cannot get warm, Eleanor, since he read you, anywhere that you are not? That is not gratitude. I have been grateful to 100 people and never once ridden through the cold at midnight to stand at their door with my heart in my hand." He drew a breath that shook. "I love you. I'm sorry to use the word. It is the only one there is, and you have made me distrust all of them, and I am saying it anyway, because the alternative is to honor your wish and go home and be a thing again, and I find I would rather be turned away as a man than spared as a duke." The frost smoked between them. The church clock began, with its groan of old gears, to tell the hour. Eleanor Vane looked at the most feared man in England, standing bare-headed in her doorway, with his own ring held out in his bare, scarred hand, asking her, not the useful her, not the clever her, not the her that wrote and warmed and mended, but the her that had written one true line in the dark to no one, and never thought to be answered. And she felt the wall she had built at 19, 7 years high, go over all at once, not pushed, but simply unsupported. For he had not argued it down. He had walked round it. He had ridden 12 miles in the cold to walk round it. Twice. "You great fool," she said, and her voice was thick, and the tears she had not let fall on the moor, or in the hall, or over her own brave, cruel letter, came now all at once. "You have ruined me twice over. You read my letter when it was sent to no one, and you have come to my door at midnight to undo the one wise thing I ever did. I told you I would never again set down a true word where a man might take it and leave the rest." "I will leave nothing," said the Duke. "That is the whole of what I am offering you. To leave nothing of you, ever, as long as I live, not your pen, which I do not need, and not your warmth, which I do not deserve, and not your cleverness, which terrifies me. The whole of you. The part Frayne never read. I have read it. It is the best thing I ever read. I will read it every day for the rest of my life, and I will never once skip a line." The clock struck 12, slow and iron, over the sleeping graves, exactly as it had a month before, and exactly as it had then. Eleanor did not slam the door. She took the ring out of his cold hand, and she did not put it on, but she closed her fist round it, and she stepped out over her own threshold into the frost in her bare feet, which was a mad thing to do, and she did it. And she put her free hand flat against the breast of his coat, where there was no letter now, only his heart going hard under the wool. And she felt him go still all over at the touch, the way a hard frost stills a field. "Once before I am old," she said, looking up at him, "I wished to be known. You have read me." Her hand pressed against his coat. I find that I should like, very much, to read you back. You have been a very difficult letter, Your Grace. I have had to read you 3 times. And the Duke of Renmore, who had not wept since his brother was buried, and did not weep now, but came nearer to it than he ever had, bent his frost-white head in the doorway of a country parsonage at midnight, and kissed the parson's daughter, once, slowly, with both his scarred hands come up to frame her cold face as though it were the most valuable thing in England, which to him it was. And the rooks in the yews did not stir, and the church clock fell silent, and the candle she had left burning at the top of the stair guttered and steadied and burned on. Lady Sabine Marlowe was gone from Renmore before the week was out, but she did not go before she came once to the parsonage, which surprised everyone, herself most of all. She came in the cold of the morning 2 days after the midnight, in a plain travelling pelisse, with none of her usual splendour, and she asked at the door, very stiffly, for Miss Vane, and Eleanor, who had every reason in the world to shut the door in her face, and found, to her own annoyance, that she could not, took her into the parlour, where the parish brought its sorrows, and sat her in the chair, and waited. Lady Sabine did not sit easily. She was a woman built for the head of a table, not the side of a parlour fire, and she held herself very straight, and she did not look at Eleanor, but at the cold window, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. What Eleanor had seen 3 nights before, she had told no one. She had been crossing the dark gallery at Renmore to find her father's cloak after the dinner, before the disaster of the reading, and she had passed the open door of a small anteroom, and within it, alone, not knowing herself observed, Lady Sabine Marlowe had been standing at the cold hearth, with a thing held flat in her white hands, a worn dance card, the little pencil still on its faded ribbon, the kind a girl keeps from her first season, and her thumb had been moving across it, across one written name, over and over, the way one wears a step hollow with going to it, and her hard, polished face had not been hard at all. Eleanor had stepped back into the dark and gone on and said nothing, then or since. She had not understood it. She thought now that she was about to. "My husband was lost to me 11 years ago," said Lady Sabine, abruptly, to the window. "He was a cousin of the old Duke's, and a fool, and I married him because he asked, and because I was 23 and frightened." She drew a breath that did not steady her. "I had loved a man who did not ask, a younger son with no fortune, who danced with me at my first season, and wrote his name on my card, and went for a soldier, and did not come back. "I have made my whole life since out of being too clever to be frightened again," she said, "and too useful to a great family to be put aside, and too beautiful to be pitied." She turned from the window at last, and her tea-colored eyes were perfectly dry and perfectly bleak. "I told myself I wanted the duchy," she said. "I have just discovered, at the cost of the only public humiliation of my life, that what I wanted was to be in a house where someone was glad I had come. I have not been glad of in 11 years. I saw that he was glad you had come," she said, "and I could not bear it, and I behaved as I behaved. I am not here to be forgiven, because I do not forgive easily myself, and I do not expect what I cannot give." She rose and drew from inside her pelisse a folded paper and laid it on the table between them, on the very table where the parish told its grief, within reach of Eleanor's hand. "That is the original fair copy I took from your book," she said. "I have not destroyed it, because it was not mine to destroy, as it was not mine to read. There is also a line of my own at the foot of it. You may read it or burn it as you choose. I find I no longer care to be the sort of woman who would rather it were burned." Eleanor took up the paper and unfolded it, and there was her own confession in her own clear hand, every word, and beneath it, in a cold, elegant script very unlike Eleanor's own, a single line had been added. "I am sorry." It was a very good letter, and I read it the way a thief reads, only for what I could take, and I am ashamed. S.M. Eleanor read it and looked up, and Lady Sabine was already at the door. "Lady Sabine," Eleanor said. The great lady stopped, her hand on the latch, her back very straight. "There is a window in this house," said Eleanor, "that the rooks watch, and I have watched it most of my life. I do not know what name was written on your dance card, but I know what it is to keep a paper one cannot send to a person one cannot reach. I keep one still." She folded the confession, and the apology with it, and did not burn either. "I am glad you came. Whatever the village says of you, I shall say that the Lady Sabine Marlowe came to a parson's parlour and said a true word with her own mouth, which is more than most of the gentle people in this county have managed in my hearing. Safe journey, madam." Lady Sabine stood a moment longer with her hand on the latch, and her shoulders came down a very little, and she said, not turning, "He is fortunate in you. I told him so. It is the only true thing I have said in this house." And then she was gone, and the rooks went up from the yews as her carriage passed the gate, and Eleanor watched it go, and put the folded paper away in the back of her commonplace book, where she kept the things she could not send. They were married in the spring, in the small black church of St. Aldhelms, because Eleanor would not be married anywhere else, and the Duke had discovered he wished for nothing she did not wish for. And the whole parish came, gentle and simple, and the smith's wife wept loudly all through the service, and was not ashamed of it. And the Reverend Mr. Vane's hands shook so on the page that the Duke, standing at the altar, reached over and steadied the book for him, which no one in the county had ever seen a duke do, and no one ever forgot. The season opened, and they did not go to it. The 41 letters a week still came, and the Duke read every one of them now, badly and faithfully, at the long library window, with his Duchess at the other end of the table reading her parish letters, the two of them writing side by side, in the warm room where it had once been so cold. And now and again he would read a phrase aloud, some petition or grief or small village hope, and she would tell him the whole story behind it, who longed and who grieved and who was afraid. And between them, slowly, over years, they answered every one. He kept the wren seal in a drawer of his desk, the stolen one, the one she had pressed her thumb into in the dark, and he would not let it be melted down or mended, though it was badly struck and the bird was lopsided, because, he said, a perfect seal would have looked like every other letter on the tray, and he had needed, that one time in his life, to see a letter that did not look like the others. And once a year, On the anniversary of the midnight, he would take it out and look at the small print of her thumb still laid across the wren, and turn his ring on his hand once, and put the seal away again, and say nothing. And she always knew what day it was by the doing of it. On the first anniversary of that midnight, Eleanor came down very late to the library at Wrenmore, in her nightgown and her shawl, because she had woken and found the bed cold beside her, and known where he would be. And she found the Duke standing at the long window in the dark, with a single candle on the desk, and the small, lopsided wren in his hand, looking out at the white frost on the parterre below. She came and stood beside him, and put her arm through his, and they looked out together at the frost. "You are thinking of your brother," she said. It was not a question. She knew the day from the seal in his hand, but she knew the look on his face from a year of reading him, and his brother was the thing he turned the ring over and never spoke. "I am thinking," said the Duke, "that he never read a letter to me in his life either, though he loved me, because we were cranes, and cranes do not put a thing on paper that they might have to mean. And I am thinking that I waited 28 years, and the whole of his life, and 2 years of being a thing, for one letter that was written to no one, and that it found me by mistake, by a stolen seal, and a careless Frank, and a clerk who did not care, and that I do not believe it was a mistake at all." He set the wren down on the sill. "I had given up the post entirely, you know. I had told Halloran to burn it. If you had directed that letter to anyone, to a name, to a sweetheart, to the man you wished existed, Halloran would have answered it for me, and I should never have seen it. It came to me only because it was addressed to no one, and I was the only no one left at Wrenmore, and the bird brought it home." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the frost lay silver on the long parterre, warming, where it caught the first grey of the coming dawn, to the colour of old gold. "I have been meaning to tell you," she said, "that I have begun a new letter, for myself, in the dark, the way I used to." She felt him go still. "To no one," he said. "To you," said Eleanor, and lifted her head, and looked up at him in the candlelight, at the hard, frightening face that the whole county feared, and that she had read so many times she knew it better than her own hand. Addressed, this time, by name. "I find I am no longer afraid to be known by the man who reads it, since he has promised never to skip a line." The Duke of Wrenmore turned from the window, and took his wife's ink-stained hand, and pressed his thumb once to the old, faded stain on her middle finger, the way she pressed it herself, when she was uncertain, which she was not any longer, ever. And he bent his head and kissed the inked place, and the candle on the desk burned steady, and below them, the frost on the parterre turned slowly gold in the rising light. "Then write it," he said, against her hand.